Hey everyone, this is a quick lecture about kind of the early stages of development. We will also touch on cognitive development and moral development in this lecture. It'll be the first of two lectures about development in AP Psych. So just a quick overview of kind of the first half of the unit. So, as far as physical development is concerned, the AP curriculum does spend a little bit of time talking about prenatal development and what happens with the developing human in the womb. And you can see that we look at three different stages. We have the zygotic stage, which is the first stage, and it lasts about 2 weeks. And here we have an egg that has been fertilized by a sperm. And what happens is we have this just rapid cell division that takes place during the zygotic stage. Right toward the very end of that stage, we start to see some specialization of cells. But it's really not until the very end, really, when we see cells begin to specialize, meaning that one cell becomes your heart, one cell, helps make up your lungs, and some cells become part of your spinal cord and things. We really see that taking place in the second stage. And the second stage is the embryonic stage. That goes from essentially the beginning of the third week until the end of the eighth week. And in the embryonic stage is when we start to see the formation of these different organs in your body. And it's one of the reasons why the second stage, the embryonic stage, is when you're most vulnerable to teratogens. And remember, those are going to be chemicals that cross through the placental barrier, that could harm the unborn child. So teratogens don't have to necessarily be some kind of illegal drug such as heroin or cocaine. Simple everyday things like caffeine, mercury that we find in fish, some of the medications that you may take if you have a headache, like Tylenol, those things can really harm the developing human. Obviously, during all of prenatal development, we are vulnerable to teratogens, but in that second stage, we are particularly vulnerable. And then the third stage is the longest stage. This is the fetal stage, and it goes essentially from the beginning of the ninth week until the baby is born. And this is when we start to see the developing human start to actually look like a human and prepare for life outside of the womb. I have a couple other notes on this slide in regard to early kind of physical development. That first one, maturation. Think of maturation as essentially this set pattern for physical development. And really, there's not a lot that we can do to influence this. For example, babies are going to likely be able to roll over before they have the ability to crawl. They're going to be able to crawl before they can stand unsupported. Those are aspects of maturation. And even with the most loving help from parents, there's not a lot of things that we can do to speed this process up. In other words, there's not a lot that parents can do to make their infants crawl any faster than when they're simply ready to crawl, or walk any sooner than when they're simply ready to walk. And I compare that to things like puberty and menopause. There's not a lot that we can do to speed along that process. That will take place when your body is physically ready for those things to happen. And then synaptic pruning, we've discussed a little bit, but the idea behind synaptic pruning is your brain goes through a process of getting rid of unnecessary neural connections. And so in those first couple of years of life, your brain is making billions and billions of connections between neurons. Some of those connections we don't need, they're unnecessary. And so around 2 years old, we go through the first of these two different times in our life when we go through rapid synaptic pruning. And the second time happens around puberty. And synaptic pruning, you can almost think of it like a bonsai tree, where you go in and you kind of snip and take away the different branches and twigs and things that are unnecessary. That's kind of what happens in our brain. And then as far as what happens to our mind, not our physical brain, but our mind ourself, perhaps one of the most famous psychologists that studied cognitive development was a guy named Jean Piaget. And according to Piaget, we progress through these four very predictable stages of cognitive development. And you can see them listed here. The first stage is what we call the sensory motor stage, and you can think it starts with sensory motor. That's kind of your mnemonic. It's the first 2 years of life, and one of the big developmental milestones that takes place during sensory motor is the understanding of object permanence. That even if you have an object and you can't see it, you recognize that the object still continues to exist in the world. It's during the sensory motor stage that we learn about the world through our senses and through our motor abilities. It's why infants shake objects, why they put objects in their mouth, why they may smell objects, because they're learning about the world that way. Around the second birthday, we transition into what's called the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. And with pre-operational, if you want to learn about the world, you start asking questions because language develops during this stage. It goes from around 2 years old until around 6 years old. And some other big things that happen in pre-operational. Children in pre-operational are often very egocentric. And the idea behind egocentrism, it's not selfishness. Egocentrism is the idea that you view the world through your own eyes, both literally speaking, but also, symbolically speaking, and struggle to really understand the perception of other people during the pre-operational stage. We also lack conservation and the law of conservation, this idea that objects can change their shape or their form, but it doesn't necessarily change their mass. When we see the law of conservation starting to develop, and so when a child is able, for example, to recognize that a ball of Play-Doh is the same amount of Play-Doh as when it's rolled into a long snake, that is an indicator that they may have moved into the third stage. And the third stage is the concrete operational stage. In concrete operational, if you think concrete is solid, it's hard. And that's really how their mindset is. The mindset of concrete is very logical. It's very kind of black and white thinking. Children in the concrete operational stage, they struggle understanding sarcasm because they take the world for what it is. It's not really until that fourth stage, what we call formal operations, that children can transition from this very strict logical thinking into abstract thinking. And with abstract thinking, we are able to reason hypothetically and reason about things that we perhaps have not personally experienced in our life. And then with Piaget's cognitive development, our last slide looks at how that impacts moral development. So there was a man named Lawrence Kohlberg. He was a professor at the University of Chicago. And Kohlberg was curious about how we develop our morals. And he created the Heinz dilemma. And you maybe remember talking about this in class. And remember, kind of a brief summary is there was a man named Heinz, and his wife was very sick. And he couldn't afford the medication that might potentially save her life. And so he was faced with this dilemma to whether or not he should steal this drug in an attempt to help his wife. And Kohlberg wasn't ultimately really concerned about, whether or not Heinz should steal or not steal this drug. What Kohlberg wanted to know was, what are the reasons behind people acting one way or another? In other words, why do we do things that we consider to be right or wrong? He believes that moral development progresses through these kind of three stages. Pre-conventional is this first stage, and pre-conventional is tied very closely to Piaget's. If you look here, the pre-operational. Pre-operational is egocentric, and that's really kind of what pre-conventional is like. It's egocentric. It's focused on itself, whether that being avoiding punishment or gaining some kind of reward. So Heinz should steal the drug because he doesn't want to live without his wife. The focus is on himself. The second stage, conventional moral reasoning, is similar to the concrete stage. It's very logical. It's very black and white. And in the conventional moral reasoning, we base our morals off of some set standard. Maybe we base our morals off of the law of the land, what is established by our government. Maybe we base our morals off of some higher being and spirituality and what our religion says. And so You want to be accepted. You want to obey. You want to be a good citizen in the conventional moral reasoning. Heinz should steal the drug because it's his responsibility to protect his wife. The focus is not on him. The focus is on society believes that's what he should do to be a good citizen. Or maybe you say Heinz shouldn't steal a drug because our government says that good citizens don't steal, right? And then lastly, we have the post-conventional moral reasoning, which is really similar to this formal thought, this abstract thought, thinking outside of the box. And at this point, it's important to recognize that your moral reasoning is based off your own universal values, which may or may not coexist with your religion or your government. Perhaps there's a law that you disagree with, that you think, no, that's not true. And so when you're basing your own personal morals off of this kind of universal ethical code, that's what we call conventional moral reasoning. So, real quick run through on this first part of development. Our next lecture will cover some more names and some more stages. Until then, best of luck. Take care.